If you have a young, insecure person who is living at kind of the whim of our nihilistic culture, that young person can easily fall into a deep kind of involvement in his or her own inward narratives of what things mean, what his or her place is in the world, how he or she's going to function in their important relationships. The ruminative nature of that thought does not come from nowhere. It comes from pain, and it is an attempt to understand the problem and to cure it so that the pain goes away. People don't ruminate for fun, they ruminate because they are looking for something.
You must be some kind of therapist?
Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dean Abbott. He is a chaplain, coach, and author living in the Midwest. And as you might have noticed if you normally see these on YouTube, we are not able to get our video to work today. We had a lot of technical difficulties and eventually decided, okay, we'll just do this as an audio only. If you're listening, nothing should be different. But what is different about our experience of speaking is that we can't see each other. So that'll perhaps promote a different way of thinking. Anyway, this was when I would normally smile at my guest and see him smiling back. But Dean, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. Having to go audio only is a shame because I sat down at the computer today and looked at myself and I thought, this is probably the handsomest you've ever been. It's just, I'll probably never be this handsome again.
You having a good hair day?
Yeah, that's let's put it that way. No, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I put time into my makeup for nothing, but at least I can occupy a somewhat cozier position on the couch, which feels appropriate for the mood of this dreary February day that we're recording on. Before we started recording, I was just kind of venting about some of my recent hardships, and you seem like a nice person to talk to when life gets real. The reason that I initially invited you here is, I've been following you on X for some time and you seem like a really thoughtful person. And you'd shared this post about healthy versus unhealthy introspection. And I really noticed that because it's something that I talked about in a recent conversation here with Brant Elwood. And it's something that I think is very relevant to the topic of mental health, psychology, spiritual growth, all that kind of stuff. I feel like introspection is something that is generally praised, especially in those fields. But where do we draw the line between introspection and rumination or narcissism for that matter? So I thought you'd be a great person to have that conversation with.
I hear this all the time. I actually heard it. I saw some video on YouTube about this today. That you know, encouraging psychology encourages people to look inside themselves, and that's why we have so many narcissistic young people, that kind of argument. And I think most famously, I remember hearing Abigail Schreier promoting her book on the Joe Rogan podcast say, well, rumination is the number one symptom of depression. And so what happens is that these people go to a therapist who encourages their rumination, and they really need to think about something other than themselves. I'm sure you've heard that kind of argument.
Yeah, and I've made similar arguments, but I feel like there's a lot of context and nuance surrounding them. I'm curious what you think of the argument that you just summarized.
I don't think that argument holds at all. Okay. I think that, first of all, when I travel around the world, I don't look around at particularly young people today, look at how they operate, and I think, the problem is that guy, he's just too introspective. If I'm at the grocery store and there's a bunch of young guys behaving poorly, I never think, wow, the problem with that guy is that he just wonders too much if he's doing the right thing. I mean, this idea that young people are obsessively introspective, in my experience, first of all, is not borne out at all. And that comes from someone who has been a teacher both at the high school and at the university level, done that a lot. And I've never thought, wow, my students just know themselves too well. Right.
Well, I mean, if you equate introspection with knowing yourself, but there's the rub, right? Because isn't it sort of like introspection gives the promise of self-knowledge?
Yes. Well, I think that we do have young people who are ruminative, let's say that, right? That they are caught up in their own inward narratives. So let's start with that. If you have a young, insecure person who is living at kind of the whim of our nihilistic culture, that young person can easily fall into a deep kind of involvement in his or her own inward narratives of what things mean, what his or her place is in the world, how he or she's going to function in in their important relationships. And part of the what makes that happen, I think, is two things, and this is why I don't necessarily agree with the Abigail Schreier argument, is that the ruminative nature of that thought does not come from nowhere. It comes from pain. And it is an attempt to understand the problem and to cure it so that the pain goes away. People don't ruminate for fun. They ruminate because they are looking for something. So it's more like it's not that they are necessarily, I don't think, narcissistically self obsessed. They're like a person who believes he or she has lost something of great value in his home and can't stop looking for it because they think that if they can get the lost thing back, the fear and pain that they're experiencing will go away. So the issue isn't that they just enjoy looking for lost things too much. The issue is what have they lost? And are they going about it in the right way? And I don't think the Abigail Schreier kind of argument accounts for that at all.
You're raising the question of why we ruminate in the first place. Our mind is trying to solve a problem. Something hurts,
Right.
which you framed as something that feels missing or lost or something that we feel a need to fix. But it seems like we're not always very good at thinking through how to solve those problems. And so rumination can lead to getting stuck instead.
Sure, you just keep looking forever, right? But I think there's another part of that that is really missed. And that is that there is a kind of unhealthy rumination that is like constantly seeking within the self answers to questions that can only halfway be answered within. In our culture, we don't have the other half. So let's say unhealthy rumination is a kind of pointless thinking about, say, negative experiences you've had, where the content of your thoughts is essentially the same, and it just goes over and over and over. But in order to make your thinking, I think, about your own growth and your problems productive, it has to be done in light of some external standard. So, some external input that you receive from somewhere that our culture does not offer to most people.
What do you mean by an external standard?
Well, I'm just making the point that there's a difference between a kind of nihilistic rumination in which a person just rehearses their pain, okay, or engages in fantasies of what I should have said to that person who hurt me, or if I were a better or different kind of person, I wouldn't have sustained these losses. But there's no external meta narrative in our culture to tell anyone what a loss means. So I would, for example, contrast this kind of pointless nihilistic rumination with a kind of serious practice of Christian self-examination. And I'm just using the Christian model here because I'm a Christian, that's what I'm familiar with. But in a serious model of Christian self-examination, we are always looking at ourselves, looking at what's happening inside us, becoming aware of our feelings, our desires, our motivations, etc. And we can reflect on those at great length and look at our formative influences. But we can do that in a way that does not become depressive, doesn't become narcissistic, or orient us toward withdrawal from the world. Because we have within the Christian narrative, we have a program of sort of growth, and we have an external standard for what we should be. And so we can ask ourselves not just the question, where's this lost thing, right? And why did all this happen to me? We could actually ask ourselves, what would it look like for me to grow into the kind of person I should be? And that's a much more productive question for self examination than a kind of pointless nihilistic rumination. I don't know if the distinction I'm making is clear.
Well, I'm wondering how vulnerable I should get on my own podcast because once I put something out there, it's like it's out there. But this feels really close to home recently and I'm thinking of giving an example. So I'll see if I can use myself as an example without saying anything I regret. So lately I've been feeling that sense of loss, sort of like a bereft feeling because my social life isn't what I wish it was.
Mhm.
I spend all day online talking to people. 1 day a week, I record podcasts. 4 days a week, I coach. So I'm talking to people online all the time and usually in a role where I'm helping or advising, guiding, instructing, hosting, interviewing. The focus is on being generative and generous toward others. And then during my free time, I try to build community locally, but that also often puts me in the role where I'm the one extending myself to others. I'm hosting, inviting, networking, and I've noticed that I'm not getting a lot back. And I recently had some personal hardships where I really needed a friend. I really needed a support system and couldn't find it. I couldn't find the type of support system I was looking for. And it was like, well, why not? I've certainly hosted my share of dinner parties. I reach out, I'm helpful and kind to people. I introduce people to people that they will like. Why isn't that support system there for me? So I found myself kind of constantly on the verge of rumination in an unhelpful direction and trying to like pull it back, finding that part of me that I know is just trying to solve a problem, right? It's I'm in pain. Where are my friends? Who can I lean on? Have I done something wrong? What have I not done right to like find myself lacking that support system? Is it my fault? Is it their fault? And I'm curious about that Christian self-examination that you described, because it gives a little bit of a framework to think about what Jesus encourages us to do in terms of, the way that we extend ourselves to others without expectation of return. But then in practice, not living in the kingdom of heaven where everyone is, equally kind and generous, it can become a little wearisome. What would be like an example of a Christian self-examination method of reflecting on something like that loneliness or that feeling of lack of reciprocity?
Well, I think what you've described, I would begin to want to examine an assumption that has arisen that you talked about, right? Which is that we put ourselves out there with no expectation of return. And I'm not sure that's true. So this is part of so let me walk through the what I'm thinking about. It would be like a healthy kind of self-examination. You find, okay, I'm having a rough time and I'm lonely. I think that's the central problem you're describing there. I'm lonely. I don't feel connected to people the way I want to. So then it comes up, well, I'm putting myself out there and I'm not getting back much. So now the question is, do I get angry about that? Or do I try to now that becomes a solvable problem? And a lot of the differentiation between a kind of nihilistic self rumination versus a more Christian or more directed, more productive self examination is whether or not solvable problems come up. Because if you live in a nihilistic world, then there aren't very many problems that are solvable because it is the basic nature of reality that you can't ever solve your fundamental problem because nothing matters, nothing there's no very little external structure for your emotional life. But when you have some external structure for your emotional life, you can then say, well, okay, so part of the reason I'm lonely is because I'm telling myself I do these things without expecting anything in return. And at that point, you can either become resentful or you could think, well, maybe that's not the case. That you are a human being who has limits and you're created as a limited creature. And what it means to be a limited creature is to have needs. And so now the question is, okay, so that's legitimate. It's a legitimate thing you are saying you need. You need connection. Now it's just a matter of like what action can be taken to solve that problem. So you're actually becoming a person who, unlike the person who's obsessed with looking through his house, you actually become a person who kind of has an inkling where the thing you're looking for might be. And you begin to think about how to take action to make that happen because you have kind of come to a point where your self-examination has revealed your legitimate need. Is that clear?
I'll tell you where I struggle with that. So I'm not like your conventional Christian. I'm trying to follow Jesus. I ran into some problems with the Old Testament, and the only person whose answers to those questions made any sense to me is someone who says that he left the Christian church to follow Jesus and has a much different interpretation of those things. And I was listening to a talk by this individual recently where he talked about the history of Jesus's followers, which began in the first century AD, just being known as the Way, as I'm sure you know better better than I do. And the moral of the story after listening to this whole talk on the history of the church was invite others to your home and have them over for dinner and extend your kindness toward them and try to be that extension of Jesus's love in the world, and I thought, we're not doing half bad. That is what we have been doing, my husband and I. We have been hosting dinner parties and, meeting and connecting with people and giving hospitality, and so I think I found a tension because there's a part of me that feels like that's the kind of person I wanna be. I wanna be that generous host, and then there's another part of me that's like, "Wait a minute. You've been to my house 5 times, and I haven't been to yours once?
Right.
You've come to all these things I've invited you to, but it's never occurred to you to invite me to anything, and where do I reach my limit?" And so I think it's a question for me of, like, which path is following Jesus, right? Do I 'cause I don't think that continuing to extend myself where there's a lack of reciprocity is healthy for me, but I also think that it's a reflection of my values. Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out that there are needs and limits, but I'm curious, especially because you do have that Christian framework. Like, what is that external standard that we measure ourselves by?
In terms of what, like how generous we are?
Yeah.
Well, I think we have a hierarchy with regard to our generosity in anything, right? So we all, for example, would not think, well, I should serve people so fully that I just stop sleeping and I'm never going to sleep again, right? So the question is, in what way is your need for relational reciprocity different from your need for sleep? And I don't think it is particularly different because they're both necessary for your flourishing into the sort of fullness of whom you are, for the person you're created to be. And you need relational reciprocity for that, just like you need sleep. Then there is no clear cut standard. Okay. Because a lot, I think of, I mean, this is going kind of a different direction than I had thought, but a lot of kind of living a Christian life is the development of wisdom. And so I can't say to you, well, you should have people over 6 nights a week. Don't have that authority. But what I can do is to encourage you, for example, to be realistic about your needs and to not dismiss those out of a kind of hyper spirituality. And once you've accepted that you have those needs, then it's a matter of developing wisdom about what works for you to move you toward that end of sort of becoming the fullness of yourself. So it's a wisdom issue and not an issue of a specific rule following.
And I take it, to return to the original subject, that that would be part of your definition of healthy introspection, that
Yeah,
wisdom.
yeah, yeah. Is to yes, yes. So there is a kind of introspection that is nihilistic, and there is a kind that leads to wisdom. And I'll say something about wisdom because it is a quality that I think you can look around in the world and see the world is not overflowing with it necessarily. But particularly when you want to talk about Christian people, I think oftentimes in many Christian subgroups, contexts, etc., there's almost a kind of anti-wisdom. What I mean by that is that it is part of kind of the moral, spiritual faith development of a lot of people to go through stages. And one of those stages is give me a rule for everything. Or it is how much can I do this without feeling bad? Right? Like how much can I have people over before I start to feel like I'm being taken advantage of? We got to get kind of stuck in this emotional thing where then we think, but can I trust those emotions? Or we look outward to our church or even to the Bible or whatever for a very clear rule about everything. But really, that's like one phase of faith development and moral development. Whereas long term, what you're trying to do is get to a phase where you have internalized the Christian perspective, the gospel perspective on things, and you as an individual have to take moral responsibility for making the decisions for your own life where there is no clear-cut rule. So I can tell you, Stephanie, you should not commit murder. There's a very clear biblical command not to do that, right? I can't tell you, you should have people over 6 nights a week because I don't know what it's like to be in your body. I don't know what it's like to be in your marriage. I don't know what it's like to be where you are financially, anything. And so that becomes a decision you have to make as wisely as possible.
Tell us more about the qualities and processes of healthy introspection and how they differ from unhealthy, let's say, narcissistic rumination, for example.
I think healthy introspection leads to hope. Let's say it that way, because you come to know yourself, you know the standard, and I mean, we could use some other standard too, like, like there's a kind of a revival in stoicism that's been going on for the last 3 years, and a lot of I think what the appeal of stoicism is, probably, particularly among young men, is that it provides a kind of moral standard. So, in stoicism, makes a lot of puts a lot of emphasis on not being reactive and being a victim to things that you can't control. And so, young man, let's say he's read some Stoic literature and he's starting to reflect on himself. Okay, I'm feeling really upset about this. I'm really angry. I'm really sad. Is this something I can control or not? So he appeals then to an external school of thought, an external standard, an external truth that structures his internal rumination. So he doesn't fall into just confusion. And he can say, yes, it's something I can't control. So therefore I have the hope that I can become the kind of person who is less reactive to this. And so it leads to the hope of increased internal structure out of which we can respond to the difficulties and vicissitudes of life without collapsing into narcissistic rumination about not even just about ourselves, but about our experience and about other people and that kind of thing. So the problem I have with the Abigail Schreier sort of argument is that takes it only offers two options, which is stop thinking so much about yourself or just focus on something else. And neither of those is deep enough to actually promote any kind of growth on the part of a human being. And what you really have to have is lots of self-examination in light of an external standard or a standard you want to live up to or a goal you want to achieve. I'll say one more thing too. I do coaching with mostly with men, though I do coach women at times too. It is really interesting because I coach people from all kinds of faith backgrounds. And what we always do at the beginning, what I always do is we do a real thorough inventory of that person's goals and desires. And I find that especially with men, you say, well, what do you want in life? And they have zero clue. Because, if you're a man and a lot of times you go your whole life, people don't ask you that. And so when I ask them, many men have no idea. And so even if they aren't particularly religious or philosophically oriented, a lot of times just having a clear sense of who they are and what they actually want is enough to pull them out of that kind of depressive rumination and put them on a path that actually is leading somewhere. I don't think, like, contra Abigail Schreier, I don't think rumination leads to depression. I think that what probably leads a lot of people to depression is a lack of any kind of internal structure, even if that just comes from their own goals.
It's so much easier to identify what's wrong or the feeling that something is wrong than identify what that signifies a lack of that we might be able to build in our lives.
Yes, I think that is true. And it takes a lot of work to get to the point where we see that feeling as information about something instead of just an immediate reaction, right? So we have a feeling that we're lonely. And I think it's very typical to think, well, I shouldn't be. So either something's wrong with me or something's wrong with other people. And so I get resentful toward them and I start to hate myself. And then I become very critical of myself. Might say, well, you wouldn't be lonely if you were better in this way or that way. But all of that is very unproductive when really what we need to think is, well, okay, I'm feeling really sad because I don't have any connections. And that tells me that I'm built for relationship and I have to be responsible for putting myself in a situation where I'm getting at least some of that need met. What are some practical things I could do to get that? And I just think that transition from my emotions are an overwhelming reality that I can do nothing about to my emotions are telling me something important about what I need and who I am and what my situation is like and what can I do about it. That's a huge and just absolutely critical transition for people to make as we're all growing up.
Your trans identified kid won't listen to reason because reason isn't what they need right now. They need a parent who knows how to communicate in an empathic yet strategic manner. ROGD Repair gives you over 120 lessons in the psychology and communication tools that actually work when normal parenting doesn't. Plus, RepairBot, your 24/7 AI coach trained on my entire body of work, ready to help you navigate tough moments in real time. Visit rogdrepair.com and use code SOMETHERAPIST2026 to take half off your first month.
We're talking about emotional intelligence, being able to decode our emotions, what they're telling us about our needs, and to identify those needs as things that we can fulfill through actions, and it takes vulnerability to do that because there's always the parts of the picture we can't control, especially when we're talking about social needs, which are such a huge part of the picture. I think where I am tempted to enter a negative cycle of rumination would be if I were to get lost in the thought that, well, I've already done all the things, I've hosted and invited and I've done all these things and it's not working. So therefore, what's wrong with me? Or like you say, what's wrong with other people? But to have that hope that you're talking about requires faith and vulnerability because there has to be openness to the possibility of maybe there's another course of action I can take even in a world where other people are unpredictable, and the only thing I can control is my own actions. Still, I have to trust that the world has enough coherence and enough basic goodness that I can kind of put one foot in front of the other and take steps that seem like they're likely to lead me to that goal and just hope for the best.
Yes, I don't know if you follow Jonathan Shedler on Twitter. He's a very well-known psychologist and someone I've learned a lot from and whom I respect. But he's recently been writing a little bit about how the psychology project, as he calls it, is not moral education. And that has, for example, makes psychology different from any kind of religious counseling, which he thinks somehow consists primarily of moral education. But really, it doesn't. Now, I want to talk about two things. The first thing I would talk about is that our culture has entirely lost the notion of formation and of experience and education as formative. When I was in high school, I had a wonderful teacher whom I was friends with for a decade until he died in 2024. And I remember he had a drawing on the wall in his classroom, and it was a drawing of a human head, and the top had been flipped open like a hinge, and there were books pouring into it. And I remember he talked about this is an example of what your education should not be. You're not here to just have us pour these facts into you, but rather he was a English and literature teacher, but rather the things that you read and experience, they shape you almost as if you are clay. Okay. But we don't in our culture have any real notion of human and spiritual formation. And we think, well, so like education is, becomes just about knowing about your facts. The media you consume has no formative effect on you. It's just something you are entertained by for a couple of hours and it's gone. Your relationships with one another don't really change the shape of your mind and soul. What is friendship for in our culture anyway, other than just a person that you don't mind doing fun things with? And I think part of what we're discussing here, it becomes kind of anorexic when we lose that concept of formation. And so that like our lives, as we try to move away from a kind of narcissistic way of thinking, that we can't just flip a switch and do that. It's a long process of formation. And I think we all would be more compassionate with one another if we tended to see people in the process of their formation somewhere. If we said, look, we're all growing up and we're all growing up at different rates and in different ways. And how can we be positive influences on one another's formation? Like the people you encounter, they're clay like. How are you going to make them something stronger or more beautiful?
That's really beautiful, and it resonates with my understanding of people. I don't use the word formation, but I might have to borrow that. I often talk about development because so much of the work I do, I mean, exclusively the work I do when I'm not podcasting, I am talking to parents who are concerned about their adolescent and young adult children. So I have that formative, what I usually call developmental, but a formative lens, right? Thinking, I've often advised parents, for instance, most young people when they're 17, 18 are quite narcissistic, but how you respond and how the rest of the world responds to that stage in their development is a big part of what shapes who they'll be when they're 30 years old, right? They are this work in progress, and I even explain and I break down, like, why a young person, as they're gearing up for this intimidating thing called adulthood, why they form a false sense of self in order to deal with it in the first place as a coping mechanism, and what are the factors that kind of influence whether that coping mechanism can fall away gradually as a real true self emerges, or whether they lean more and more heavily into the false self that they've constructed. So I'm going to have to borrow that word formation. And, it's rarely more true than when it comes to parenting young people, but I like how you apply that lens to people at all stages in their lives, because we do never stop growing, and we shape what we bring out in one another.
Yeah, and I think too, I want to make a distinction between development and formation.
Okay.
That, I believe that, and I'm obviously not the only one, but that human beings have a kind of internal plan for their development. And we develop according to that. But that process, and I don't think that just like biologically, I really think that is true uniquely for each individual, that there is a kind of real self that you're supposed to develop into, but that process goes haywire in many, many ways, as you're talking about, right? And it becomes the development of coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms, the false self, all of that. And the question in a formation is, what do we do to form one another in ways that are more in alignment with that original plan, right? How can, and I'm sure this is what you're talking to the parents about, is how do you respond to a narcissistic 17-year-old in a way that's formative? They're clay like. How do you shape them in a way that's more aligned with that inner sense of development that's happening within them that has been short-circuited in some way by trauma, loneliness, the difficulties of life, whatever it is.
Or just a lack of the right formative experiences. I think especially with a lot of young people being impacted by the pandemic lockdowns. I mean, I find it so hard to create a social life as I've been talking about throughout this conversation, and I sympathize with young people because at least I had a social life when I was young, pre-pandemic, pre-smartphones, right? Pre, this at least this level of social media, so there can be that lack of experience. But I think what you're talking about, it also takes emotional intelligence and intimacy because it requires a degree of faith that you know something about who that person is capable of becoming, right? When you talk about sort of the plan for the individual, it's not just a universal plan of what's good for a human being and what virtues we want to see everyone cultivate, but also that each one of us has certain gifts. And I think that's part of what makes parenting require that emotional intelligence and faith and intuition is that you have to have some degree of insight into who that person is capable of becoming. Not just what you want them to become or what you thought they might become when they were little, but really what are those seeds within them that are trying to sprout?
Right. You mentioned the thing that I wanted to talk about formation, and you mentioned the other thing I wanted to talk about, which is virtue. And that the difference between pointless narcissistic rumination and a kind of self examination that is healthy is one leads to virtue and one does not. And so, to take a little bit of issue with Dr. Shedler, I think that to say psychology, therapeutic enterprises, or whatever are not fundamentally moral education, but rather trying to allow the client to discover his own, I guess, his own moral framework or something. The problem with that is that we have literally thousands of years of literature showing us what works in human life and what does not.
I agree.
Right? Going all the way back to Aristotle or before. It's interesting. For Christmas, I was given a set of books, and one of them was the Dhammapada, which is a collection of 400 sayings attributed to the Buddha. The Buddha was clearly a very wise person. And if you did nothing but read the Buddha and think, well, hey, he seems to know what he's talking about, and you try to do some of the things that he suggests, or you read Marcus Aurelius, like I was talking about, or Aristotle, or even into the Middle Ages, someone like Boethius, these people are all talking about how to live the right kind of life. And I think to act as if we don't have thousands of years of resources telling us what the right kind of human life is when we go into like a situation where we're working with people is in a way kind of to abandon them. And instead to say, all right, look, you don't have to reinvent the wheel on your own. There is a real thing called virtue, and it's part of what you can grow into. And the more you pursue virtue, the more you will become the best expression of your unique self. So we don't have that in our culture at all because we are cut off from all those sources of wisdom telling us very clearly what the good life looks like.
I agree, and I think this is one of my kind of major complaints about what we could call a liberal approach to psychotherapy, which is that it lacks a framework of what we know is generally good for the human soul. There's kind of this anything goes philosophy, and I saw a therapist, post something I thought was quite wise on social media saying that the difference between a less good therapist and a more expert therapist is a less good therapist, you're in the driver's seat, they're in the passenger seat, they have the map, they know where you're going, they tell you where to turn. And they said a more skilled therapist sits in the back seat, looks out the window and says, "Hmm, interesting. You told me the last time you drove down this street, you got beaten up. I wonder why you're choosing to go down this street again." The problem with that framework, as much as I agree halfway with that comparison, the problem is that in that narrative, the only reason we know that that's not a healthy street for that person is because they've personally been beaten up down that street before. What about the reality of if 100 other people had been also beaten up on that street, just because that particular person hasn't necessarily been down that street. It's like, do we have to reinvent the wheel with every single human being? I'm not saying that we have to apply one rigid moral framework to all human beings in a way that doesn't allow for any individuality, but at the same time, it kind of feels, with a more liberal, progressive approach to psychotherapy, that every individual is in it to learn things from first principles themselves. That if we had a little bit more openness to that wisdom of the past, at which you could consider a more conservative approach, not politically, but in the sense that we're preserving what we know, what has already been built, rather than questioning it constantly. If we relied on the knowledge that what's true for other people is probably true for me, we could actually potentially spare ourselves a lot of pain. Like, an example of that is if you take a person at any age and ask them to imagine what they're going to want at a different age in the future. Let's say 20 versus 60. Ask your average 20-year-old, what are you going to want when you're 60? I think if you looked at the responses, you would find that what 20-year-olds imagine they're going to want when they're 60 is closer to what they want when they're 20 than what they will actually want when they're 60, and that a better guess of what they're going to want when they're 60 would come from looking at what the average 60-year-old wants. Your guess, you as an individual at 20, if you're planning your life at 60, are probably going to make wiser decisions that you're going to be happier with if you base your future planning off of what does the average person want at that time in life compared to what I currently value and think that I want. And yet we go about psychotherapy as if every 20-year-old can imagine what they're going to want based on their current wants rather than, like, the human condition.
I think you casually said something very important, which is that if we can kind of come to see that what is true for the vast majority of people is probably true for me. You said you were kind of referring to that as a means of cultivating wisdom, but I would just point out it's also a good way to combat loneliness. And that when you sort of come to see yourself as another instantiation of kind of the human experience, and you suddenly realize, oh, any of these writers or thinkers that or people from the past, they're not so different from me. It places you inside a larger human narrative that I think does help at least somewhat to resolve an existential loneliness that I think most people feel in a liberal culture, a liberal in the sense that it is about liberating one from the wisdom of the past. I think most people do feel an existential loneliness that if they were more familiar with the kind of the thinking of the past, they might feel less existential loneliness. And just to close the loop on the thing about psychology and moral education, I think that, yes, well, I think what we're saying is that for a lot of therapeutic relationships to be successful, it really does have to have some level of moral education, or you're kind of leaving help on the table that you could offer to people who are suffering.
I'm trying to think of an example of that because I think I know what you're talking about, in the sense that if someone is behaving in a way that the average person would consider immoral, like their behavior is hurtful to others, it's also hurtful to themselves. That's what I believe, at least, that when we're selfish, when we take, lie, cheat, steal, that damages our soul. And it's one of the reasons that I'm able to guide parents lovingly into interventions that they're hesitant to embrace, but that their kid's behavior calls for, because it's sort of like taking away the toy when a kid isn't using that toy properly, right? Like, the rule is that toy is not to be used to hit your brother with. And if you are using the toy to hit your brother, then we're taking away the toy because that's not what it's for. And I think, as much as you might do that when a kid is 5, there are similar things when someone's 20 where it's not just that they're harming others, but that this isn't good for, as you would say, their formation.
Let me give an example that's just occurred to me. Imagine 20-year-old guy. He's doing okay in life, like, he's got, like, a group of guy friends or whatever, but secretly, on his phone every day, he's, like, really into sports betting, okay? And let's say he's lost a lot of his, like, regular income from whatever job he has, and he's made the foolish decision to take out a credit card so he can gamble there more. Okay, that's a problem for that guy, and I don't think anyone would deny that that's a problem. So the question then of moral education is that we have to say, look, there's a virtue of self-control, there's a virtue of stewardship, there's a virtue in being a forward-looking person. The problem with trying to talk about moral education is that people think that it stops at saying, "Hey, don't gamble." Well, sure, not gambling would be the great thing for this guy. But the problem of being a human being is that we can't just stop. We have a very hard time not doing those things, no matter how much we know they're a problem. And this is where now we can do some structured self examination. And we ask, what is that doing for you? Right? Tell me more about what's going on inside you when you decide to do that. We ask much deeper questions that help us to come to understand the core of this person and what's being expressed in this action that is hurting him and hurting others in a way, or could potentially hurt others, could potentially drive him to even more desperate and negative behavior. So it's not just a matter of saying, hey, gambling is bad, don't do it. We really have to dig down, and I think help people like that to the degree that we can do that kind of deep inner examination of themselves in terms of what's going on here with you. And you were talking about the therapist who says, "Hey, turn here," or the one who says, "I notice you've driven down this street." And I do think the one who says, "I noticed you chose to drive down this street," that probably is the better therapist. But it's easy to confuse means and ends. And so with the guy who's addicted to gambling, let's say we say, "Oh, I noticed that you really you spent more money in the last 6 months on your father's birthday than on any other day." Right? That's an interesting thing to notice, right? I'm curious about what's going on there. That is a way that's a technique. But that's a means, but the end, his growth in virtue, his growth in freedom, his formation into more of the person he's meant to be. And so I think a lot of when we talk about kind of standard psychological approach is a confusion of means and ends. We think a lot of people tend to think asking the better question or making the better observation is an end in itself, but it's actually just a better means for getting to the real end, which is positive formation, development and virtue, freedom to be more of the person that you really are, those kinds of things.
I don't want to straw man Jonathan Shedler and put words in his mouth that he didn't say, but I am tempted to join you in making the case for why something I don't know if moral education is exactly the right word for it, but like the thing about healing or self-improvement or behavior change or whatever the goal of psychotherapy might be is, we are moral creatures. Morality is part of what we are. The cultivation of virtue, if that's not a part of the process, then like, what are we doing? How can a person expect to feel whole, I guess, if they're not in a process of cultivating virtues?
Yes. So two things about that. First of all, when you were giving the example of the therapist who says, "I noticed you drove down the street, and the last time you mentioned this street, you told me you were beat up." Okay. The only reason the therapist is even asking that question is because the therapist has a deep internal sense that beating people up is wrong. Right? Reality is inescapably moral. That's an easy thing for people to deny, but even the story that you just told me is built on a moral framework. Because the therapist is asking in that situation, I wonder why you chose to drive down this street where something immoral happened to you. So it's inevitable. What you're saying is, how do we ever make progress if we're not trying to be formed towards some sort of virtue? That's what I was talking about at the beginning of our talk with the person who is in a ruminative spiral where she's constantly looking for that thing in the house that's lost. Is the person who's not engaged in that, deeply introspective and formative process of virtue development. It sort of resorts to kind of looking in her house everywhere for this thing that she knows is lost, but she'll never find.
Help me with one more little personal tip here, Dean.
Okay.
Because I'm really thinking, like, I'm applying our conversation to myself, and I'm thinking, generosity is such a core virtue for me and my husband. It was one of the qualities that I noticed in him
Mm.
that made me feel like we were aligned, and something I count on so deeply in him is that we're both generous and hospitable people. So I know that generosity, hospitality, gregariousness, these are things that I value that matter deeply to me and my character, and I don't wanna give them up, right? And so I'm thinking, like, if the problem that I'm looking to solve is that energy isn't coming back around to me when I need it, like, what is the virtue that's missing here? Because those are the 3 virtues that I'm saying are pretty strong that I don't wanna give up here. I'm curious because you have this sort of framework of having an external standard, right? And we're talking about the virtue. So is it just wisdom, that sort of self-knowledge like we were talking about, or is there another virtue word that would be helpful for me to hang on to here?
If you were coming to me as a coaching client, I would want to ask you, and I don't pretend to have the answer. I would want to ask you about how honest you are about your needs and how courageous you are about just telling people what you need. So we would maybe frame it in terms of honesty. And if you're willing to say, hey, this isn't working for me and I need something back, do you have the courage to do that? I don't know. But those are a couple of them, a couple of virtues that might apply.
Yeah.
Or even just to go to people and say, hey, here's what I need from you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I mean, I think long-term listeners will be like, "Stephanie Wynn, she's so honest and courageous." But about things that are bigger than myself, But when it comes to me, that's a tough one. Absolutely. And I've been practicing that lately, but it's been really hard because I've just had to cut people off. I've just had to be like, "I've known you 2 years. I've invited you to like 10 things. You've never invited me to anything. I need my friends right now. Clearly, you're not interested in being a friend, you know?"
Right. Right. Sure. And I think being honest about that is, I think that's what part of what makes you a trustworthy person, if you're willing to be honest about that. And I will say too that, virtues, they kind of apply differently in some ways at a macro level versus a micro level, right? So one thing to maybe be courageous about a political issue, it's another to have the courage to risk real personal relationships because they aren't working in some way.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Not good at being vulnerable in personal relationships. Well, tell us a little bit about I know we have to wrap up soon, so I want you to, have an opportunity to share what it is that you do cuz in a moment I'll ask where people can find you, and I know that you do coaching and that you have the title Chaplain. So I'm curious where and how does that work show up?
Well, I do lots of coaching with people who find me online. I have been in kind of a struggle the last few days because about 12 days ago, my Twitter account was hacked.
The podcast scheme, right?
Yeah, it's crypto, I think.
Was it the one where they DM you saying vote for me in this podcast competition or co-hosting?
I don't know. Maybe that sounds strangely familiar, but whatever's happening is that someone who is not me is currently using my Twitter account to scam people into buying crypto of some sort.
Oh, no. Even still? You're still locked out?
Yeah, 12 days now.
Oh, yikes. So when I was just DMing you about our technical issues, that was not you. Good thing you texted me instead.
Right. So sometimes I'm available there, and I have tended to get a lot of clients through Twitter. Recently, that's kind of changed a lot. Well, not a lot, but begun to change as I have sort of people have found me in other ways. I've taken a lot of referrals from other coaches and that kind of thing lately. So I do a lot of that. I'm also a writer. I'm kind of moving toward trying to get more involved in the writing part of my life. The chaplaincy work is sort of something that's still in development. For a long time, I've been ordained as a community chaplain, but that's a different thing from being a clinical chaplain, like you might encounter in a hospital or jail or something. There's very specific training that is required to do that, and I just finished one course of that, and that's something I'm interested in looking into too. You know, I guess what you would say is that vocationally, I'm just very interested in where in the world do I have the opportunity to bring some comfort, some light, some aid to people who are in need? I have a particular set of gifts that kind of lend themselves to particular manifestations of that mission. If I were, I don't know, a really good baker or is really good at technical things, those manifestations would look different, but I'm not either of those. And so I am just looking for those opportunities. It's part of my own formation. It's part of my own growth toward virtue to constantly sort of be asking myself that question. So people could typically have found me on Twitter at Dean Abbott, and maybe they will be someday in the future able to do that. But now I would suggest not doing that and definitely not buying any crypto from me. Instead, I can be found at deanabbott.com. That is my website and my Substack. So there's lots of things I've written there that you could read. And also there's a services tab that explains lots more about my coaching and how I work and what kind of services I offer. And also I work some with a coaching consortium called A Life Designed. And you could find out about me there, lifedesign.org/Dean.
Well, Dean Abbott, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I'm glad I finally got to know you a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, it's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.